It was a crisp autumn morning at Los Angeles International Airport, the kind where the California sun promised warmth later but hadn't quite chased away the morning chill. The first-class lounge buzzed with its usual mix of business travelers tapping away on laptops and celebrities trying to blend in behind designer sunglasses. Snoop Dogg strolled through the terminal with the easy confidence of someone who'd made this journey countless times before. He wasn't putting on any airs, just wearing a comfortable tracksuit, some statement jewelry, and carrying a sleek leather weekend bag. For him, this was just another business trip, heading to New York for meetings about his latest ventures in the entertainment and business world. The boarding process started normally enough. A mix of executives in pressed suits and well-heeled travelers made their way down the jet bridge, many doing double takes as they recognized the legendary rapper in their midst. Snoop just gave them his characteristic laid-back nod, the same one he'd been giving fans since the 90s. As he reached his first-class seat, 2A, his preferred spot by the window, Snoop settled in with practiced ease. He pulled out his phone, texting his business partner about their upcoming meetings while the cabin crew prepared for departure. A flight attendant with kind eyes and graying hair at her temples offered him a pre-flight drink. Gin and juice. She joked warmly, and Snoop chuckled, appreciating the reference to his classic kit. "Just water for now," he replied with a smile. The morning light streamed through the airplane windows, creating long shadows across the pristine first-class cabin. Other passengers were getting comfortable. A grandmother helping her grandchild get settled in their first-class experience. A tech entrepreneur who couldn't stop stealing glances at Snoop while pretending to be absorbed in his laptop. And an elderly couple who seemed more interested in their crossword puzzle than their famous cabin mate. Everything seemed perfectly normal until the co-pilot stepped into the cabin for his routine pre-flight check. The atmosphere shifted subtly at first, then more noticeably. The co-pilot's footsteps slowed as he approached row 2, his casual scan of the cabin turning into something more scrutinizing. His shoulders tensed, and his previously friendly expression hardened into something less welcoming. The first-class flight attendant was busy arranging welcome drinks on her cart when she noticed the change in the co-pilot's demeanor. She'd been flying long enough to sense when something was off, and there was definitely something different about how the co-pilot was handling his cabin check this morning. Nearby passengers picked up on the shift too. The grandmother held her grandchild a little closer. The tech entrepreneur set his laptop aside, and even the crossword-loving couple looked up from their puzzle. The casual pre-flight chatter died down to a tense silence. Snoop maintained his composure, continuing to scroll through his phone as if he hadn't noticed the co-pilot's lingering presence. But after decades in the spotlight, he could feel eyes on him without having to look up. He experienced moments like this before. Those small instances where someone's prejudices bubble to the surface, even in spaces where everyone had paid the same premium for their seat. The air felt heavier now, charged with unspoken tension. Other passengers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure if they were really seeing what they thought they were seeing. The flight attendant slowed her drink service, keeping one eye on the situation while maintaining her professional demeanor. In these first few moments, no one could have predicted how this situation would unfold, or that it would soon become a viral moment that would have people talking for months to come. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating particles of dust floating in the air, as the scene held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. This wasn't just about a celebrity being hassled in first class. It was about to become something much bigger, a moment that would spark conversations across the country about prejudice, privilege, and the power of choosing how to respond when faced with discrimination. But for now, in these initial moments, it was just a tense silence waiting to break. "Would you like me to continue with part 2 of the story?" The co-pilot cleared his throat, adjusting his uniform collar as he approached Snoop's seat. His polished shoes clicked against the cabin floor, each step echoing in the unusually quiet cabin. The other passengers watched from the corners of their eyes, pretending to be occupied with their phones or magazines. "Excuse me, sir," the co-pilot said, his voice carrying an edge that didn't match his professional appearance. "I'll need to see your boarding pass and ID." He stood with his hand extended, despite the fact that Snoop's documents had already been checked multiple times during the boarding process. A young flight attendant who had just started her drink service paused, her hands gripping her service cart a little tighter. She checked Snoop's documents herself at the gate, and everything had been perfectly in order. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, caught between maintaining professional protocol and addressing what was clearly an unusual request. Snoop looked up slowly from his phone, his expression calm, but studying the co-pilot's face. He'd been in first class on hundreds of flights, but this was different. The other passengers could feel it too. The tech entrepreneur had completely abandoned any pretense of working, and the grandmother was whispering something to her grandchild, who watched the scene with wide, confused eyes. "My documents were checked at security at the gate, and when I boarded," Snoop replied evenly, his voice carrying the kind of patience that comes from years of dealing with similar situations. "Is there a particular reason you need to see them again?" The co-pilot shifted his weight, glancing around the cabin as if seeking support. "It's just a routine check," he insisted, though everyone present knew it was anything but routine. "We need to ensure everyone in first class is properly seated." A businessman across the aisle couldn't help but notice that he hadn't been asked for his documents, nor had anyone else in the first-class cabin. He set down his coffee cup with a deliberate clink, drawing attention to the obvious disparity in treatment. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. The elderly couple with the crossword puzzle exchanged knowing looks, the wife shaking her head slightly. The tech entrepreneur had pulled out his phone, holding it low, but clearly recording the interaction. Throughout the cabin, other passengers began to do the same, sensing they were witnessing something significant. "Properly seated," Snoop repeated, his tone remaining measured but pointed. "I've been flying first class longer than some of these passengers have been alive. What exactly about my seating seems improper to you?" The co-pilot's face flushed slightly, but he stood his ground. "Sir, if you can't produce your documents, we might have to." "I can vouch for him," interrupted the senior flight attendant, stepping forward with the kind of authority that comes from decades of service. "I personally checked his documents at boarding. Everything is in order." Her voice was professional but firm, making it clear she wouldn't stand by silently. The co-pilot's jaw tightened. He looked between Snoop and the flight attendant, clearly struggling with how to proceed. The morning sun streaming through the windows cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Other passengers began to stir, their discomfort with the situation turning into quiet murmurs of disapproval. The grandmother held her grandchild closer, whispering something about treating everyone with respect. The businessman across the aisle had put down his newspaper entirely, his expression making it clear he was ready to speak up if things escalated further. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely from the casual pre-flight routine of just minutes ago. Every eye was now fixed on this interaction, watching to see how it would unfold. The air felt electric with tension, and everyone knew they were witnessing something that went far beyond a simple document check. Little did anyone know, this was just the beginning of an incident that would soon make headlines and spark important conversations across the country. The next few moments would prove crucial in determining how this situation would be remembered, and more importantly, what it would teach everyone involved about confronting prejudice in unexpected places. Would you like me to continue with part 3 of the story? The confrontation reached its turning point as the co-pilot leaned in closer, lowering his voice in what seemed like an attempt to make his next words less audible to the surrounding passengers. "Look," he said, his tone dripping with barely concealed disdain. "Maybe it has been a mix-up with your ticket. Coach might be more suitable." A collective intake of breath swept through the first-class cabin. The grandmother covered her grandchild's ears, while the tech entrepreneur's fingers flew across his phone screen, likely sharing what he was witnessing on social media. The businessman across the aisle set down his coffee cup with enough force to make the liquid slosh over the sides. Snoop straightened in his seat, his calm demeanor still intact, but his eyes showing a flash of something deeper, not anger, but the weight of countless similar experiences. More suitable, he repeated, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin. Why don't you tell me exactly what you mean by that? The senior flight attendant stepped forward again, her years of experience evident in how she positioned herself, slightly between Snoop and the co-pilot, professional but protective. Sir, she addressed the co-pilot, I need to remind you that all passengers in this cabin have been properly vetted and seated. But the co-pilot seemed to have dug himself into a position he couldn't easily back away from. We have certain standards in first class, he continued, his voice growing more defensive. We need to ensure everyone meets those standards. The elderly woman with the crossword puzzle suddenly spoke up, her voice quavering but clear. Young man, I've been flying first class for 40 years, and the only person not meeting standards right now is you. Her husband nodded firmly in agreement, setting aside their half-completed puzzle. Other passengers began to stir, their previous discomfort turning into open disapproval. Phones recorded from various angles, capturing every word, every gesture. The tech entrepreneur had abandoned all pretense of discretion, holding his phone up openly now. Let me be clear, Snoop said, his voice level but carrying an authority that made everyone in the cabin lean in slightly. I've earned my seat here, just like everyone else. The only difference is, I'm the only one being questioned about it. Now, why do you think that is? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The co-pilot's face reddened further, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. What's going on here? The captain had emerged from the cockpit, likely alerted by the unusual delay in departure preparations. He surveyed the scene quickly, the recording phones, the tense postures, his co-pilot's defensive stance, and Snoop's composed but resolute expression. The senior flight attendant stepped toward the captain, speaking in low tones, but in the quiet cabin, her words carried. He's demanding additional document checks from Mr. Snoop Dogg, sir, suggesting he belongs in coach. The captain's expression darkened as he took in the situation. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to pause, as if the very air was waiting to see what would happen next. The grandmother hugged her grandchild closer, whispering something soothing. The businessman had half risen from his seat, ready to intervene if needed. In this moment, something shifted in the cabin's atmosphere. What had started as one man's prejudice had transformed into a moment of collective witness. Every person present understood they weren't just watching a celebrity being harassed. They were seeing a stark example of the everyday discrimination that many face, played out in the confined space of an airplane cabin. The tension had reached its peak, and everyone knew the next few moments would determine how this story would end. Would it be another sad example of prejudice gone unchallenged, or would it become something more, a moment of change, of standing up, of people coming together to say enough is enough? The captain took a deep breath, his next words about to change the course of not just this flight, but the conversations that would follow in the days and weeks to come. Would you like me to continue with part 4 of the story? The captain's presence brought a new energy to the cabin. With over 20 years of flight experience, he carried himself with the kind of authority that commanded immediate respect. He looked at his co-pilot, then at Snoop, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. Can someone explain to me why we're delayed? The captain asked, though the phones recording the scene and the tense atmosphere told him plenty. The morning sun caught his captain's stripes as he turned, making them gleam significantly. Snoop spoke first, his voice steady and dignified. Your co-pilot here seems to think there's been some mistake with my seating assignment. Apparently, first class isn't suitable for someone like me. The way he emphasized suitable made its real meaning clear to everyone present. The tech entrepreneur, still recording, spoke up. He's been harassing Mr. Dogg since he started his cabin check, sir. Nobody else was asked to show the documents again, just him. Several other passengers nodded in agreement, including the elderly couple who had long since abandoned their crossword puzzle. The captain's expression hardened as he turned to his co-pilot. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of his position and responsibility. The co-pilot shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding himself under the scrutiny of not just the passengers but his superior. "I was just following procedures," the co-pilot stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. The grandmother in row 3 scoffed audibly, pulling her grandchild closer as if to shield them from witnessing such poor behavior. "I've been flying this route for 15 years, the captain said, his voice firm but controlled. "And I know for a fact that randomly demanding documents from seated passengers isn't part of any procedure." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Especially not from only one passenger." The businessman who had been watching everything unfold finally spoke up. "I fly first class twice a week, Captain. Nobody has ever asked to recheck my documents after boarding. Not once." His words carried the weight of experience, and several other regular flyers nodded in agreement. The senior flight attendant stepped forward, her professionalism unwavering. "Captain, I personally checked Mr. Dogg's documents at boarding. Everything was in perfect order, as it always is with our frequent flyers." The captain nodded, taking in all this information. He turned to Snoop, who had maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal. "Mr. Dogg, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for this completely unacceptable situation." But he wasn't finished. The captain turned back to his co-pilot, his decision evident in his stance. "You're relieved of your duties for this flight. Please gather your things and exit the aircraft." His tone left no room for argument. The co-pilot's face flushed red. "But sir, the flight. We're already behind schedule." "We have a relief pilot on standby," the captain cut in. "This kind of behavior isn't just unacceptable. It goes against everything we stand for as an airline and as human beings." The cabin fell silent as the co-pilot's shoulders slumped. He turned to leave, but before he could, Snoop's voice rang out, clear and measured. "Hold up a minute," he said, causing everyone to pause. The tension in the cabin shifted as all eyes turned to him, wondering what would happen next. Nobody expected what came next, a moment that would soon go viral and be discussed on news channels across the country. Snoop was about to handle this situation in a way that would leave everyone speechless, turning what could have been just another sad story of discrimination into something far more powerful. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating particles in the air that seemed to hang suspended, just like the breath of every passenger watching this scene unfold. What happened next would not only change the course of this flight, but would become a teachable moment about dignity, grace under pressure, and the power of choosing how to respond to prejudice. Would you like me to continue with part 5 of the story? Snoop rose from his seat with the kind of grace that comes from years in the spotlight. Standing at his full height, he commanded attention without having to demand it. The cabin fell so quiet you could hear the distant sound of airport traffic outside. "Before you leave," Snoop addressed the co-pilot, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised everyone present, "I want you to take a look around this cabin." He gestured to the diverse group of passengers, all watching intently. "What do you see?" The co-pilot, caught off guard by this unexpected turn, glanced around uncertainly. The grandmother held her grandchild closer, the elderly couple clasped hands, and the tech entrepreneur finally lowered his phone, sensing that something more important than a viral video was about to happen. "I see people," Snoop continued, not waiting for the co-pilot's response. "Just people. All of them paid for their seats, just like I did. All of them have somewhere to be, just like I do. The only difference is in how you chose to see me." The businessman nodded appreciatively, while the senior flight attendant dabbed at her eyes with a discreet tissue. The captain stood straight, respecting the moment unfolding before him. "I could be angry right now," Snoop went on, his voice thoughtful. "I've got every right to be. But anger isn't going to change anything. What's going to change things is understanding." He took a step closer to the co-pilot, who seemed rooted to the spot. The morning sun had shifted, casting long rays through the cabin that seemed to spotlight this moment. The grandmother whispered something to her grandchild, who watched with wide, understanding eyes, taking in a lesson more valuable than any classroom could provide. "You looked at me and made assumptions," Snoop continued. "Maybe they were assumptions you were taught, maybe they were ones you picked up along the way. But right now, you have a choice. We all have choices in how we treat each other." The tech entrepreneur had completely forgotten about recording, completely absorbed in the moment. The elderly woman with the crossword puzzle wiped away a tear, her husband squeezing her hand gently. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Snoop said, his voice clear and strong. "I'm asking for the same respect you'd give anyone else in this cabin. The same respect you'd want someone to give your mother, your sister, your child." The co-pilot's face had transformed from defiance to something else, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. The captain watched silently, recognizing that this moment was more powerful than any disciplinary action could ever be. "So here's what I propose," Snoop said, surprising everyone again. "Instead of you walking off this plane in shame, why don't you walk off with a new perspective? Take this moment, learn from it, and make different choices tomorrow." The senior flight attendant couldn't hold back a small sob, quickly covered by a professional cough. The businessman had set aside his phone, briefcase, and every other distraction, completely focused on the scene unfolding before him. "Because at the end of the day," Snoop concluded, "we're all just trying to get somewhere. And we'll all get there faster if we stop putting obstacles in each other's paths." The co-pilot stood still for a moment, visibly processing everything he just heard. The entire cabin held its breath, waiting to see how he would respond to this unexpected offer of wisdom instead of condemnation. This moment would soon be shared thousands of times across social media, but the real impact happened right there in that cabin. It wasn't just about a celebrity handling discrimination with unexpected grace. It was about showing everyone present that there's always a choice in how we respond to prejudice, and sometimes the most powerful response is one that opens the door to change. Would you like me to continue with part 6 of the story? The co-pilot stood frozen for a moment, his uniform suddenly seeming to weigh heavily on his shoulders. The whole cabin waited, the air thick with anticipation. Even the constant hum of the airplane's systems seemed muted, as if the aircraft itself was holding its breath. The co-pilot began, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I've never thought about it that way." His admission hung in the air, honest in its simplicity. The tech entrepreneur's phone had long since stopped recording, its owner too caught up in the raw humanity of the moment. The captain stepped forward, placing a firm but gentle hand on his co-pilot's shoulder. "Sometimes it takes someone showing us a different perspective to see our own blind spots," he said, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd seen many things during his years in the sky. The grandmother in row 3 was quietly explaining something to her grandchild, her voice a soft whisper that carried surprising clarity. "See, honey, this is how real strength looks. It's not about being angry. It's about helping others learn and grow." Snoop remained standing, his presence commanding yet compassionate. The morning sun through the windows had shifted again, casting a warm glow across the cabin that seemed to soften every edge and shadow. The co-pilot turned to face Snoop directly, his professional facade crumbling into something more genuine. "I made assumptions," he admitted, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. "I looked at you and saw what I expected to see, not who you actually are." The elderly couple exchanged knowing looks, the wife nodding encouragingly. The businessman who had been ready to intervene earlier sat back, watching respect replace tension in real time. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," Snoop responded, extending his hand. That's the first step toward making things right. The gesture was simple but powerful. An offering of dignity rather than humiliation, of bridge building rather than burning. The co-pilot looked at the extended hand for a moment before taking it, the handshake firm and sincere. The senior flight attendant smiled warmly, years of experience telling her she was witnessing something rare and valuable. "I still need to leave the flight," the co-pilot said, glancing at the captain, who nodded in confirmation. "But I want you to know, I'll remember this. Not just today, but every day I put on this uniform." Several passengers nodded approvingly, including the tech entrepreneur who had captured the earlier confrontation. He quietly slipped his phone back into his pocket, understanding that some moments deserve to be experienced rather than recorded. "That's all anyone can ask," Snoop replied, settling back into his seat with the same easy grace he'd shown throughout the entire incident. "Just do better tomorrow than you did today." The captain gestured toward the exit, and the co-pilot gathered his belongings. As he made his way down the aisle, something remarkable happened. Instead of awkward silence or harsh judgments, he was met with subtle nods of acknowledgement. The passengers recognized something universal in this moment, the human capacity for growth and change. Before stepping off the plane, the co-pilot turned one last time. "Thank you," he said, his words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested, "for showing me a better way." As the relief pilot was called in, and the flight preparations resumed, the energy in the cabin had transformed completely. What had started as an ugly display of prejudice had become something else entirely. A masterclass in handling conflict with dignity and creating opportunity for change where others might have seen only confrontation. The grandmother hugged her grandchild close, whispering, "Remember this day, sweetheart. This is how change happens, one person, one moment, one choice at a time." Would you like me to continue with part 7 of the story? As the relief pilot settled into the cockpit and final preparations for takeoff resumed, something remarkable began happening in the first-class cabin. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to a kind of warm solidarity. Passengers who had been strangers just an hour ago now shared knowing looks and gentle smiles. The tech entrepreneur, who had captured the whole incident on his phone, leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Dogg," he said, his voice carrying a mix of respect and curiosity, "would you mind if I shared what happened here today? People need to see this." Snoop considered the request thoughtfully, glancing around the cabin at the faces of those who had witnessed everything. "Sometimes," he replied, "the right story can change more minds than 1,000 arguments. Share it. But make sure you show both sides, not just the conflict, but the resolution." The elderly woman who had been working on her crossword puzzle spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "In all my years of flying, I've seen plenty of ugly moments. But I've never seen someone turn an ugly moment into something beautiful quite like that." The captain returned from getting the relief pilot situated and paused by Snoop's seat. "We're ready for takeoff now," he said, then added more quietly, "What you did today, that's going to ripple out far beyond this flight." The grandmother in the third row was still using the moment as a teaching opportunity for her grandchild. See how he chose to respond. That's real power, not in making someone feel small, but in helping them grow. As the flight attendants began their final checks, several passengers pulled out their phones, but not to record. They were sharing what they'd witnessed with friends and family, describing not just the confrontation but the transformation they'd seen. The businessman nearby overheard someone whisper, "You wouldn't believe what just happened on my flight." The senior flight attendant approached with a fresh round of drinks for everyone. "On the house," she said with a warm smile. "Some moments deserve to be celebrated." The gesture wasn't just about free drinks. It was an acknowledgement of something profound that had touched everyone present. As the plane began to taxi, Snoop gazed out his window at the morning sun now high in the sky. The tech entrepreneur was right. By nightfall, this story would be spreading across social media, not as another viral moment of conflict, but as something far more meaningful. A testament to the power of choosing grace over anger, understanding over confrontation. The elderly couple had finally returned to their crossword puzzle, but they were working on it together now, heads bent close, occasionally glancing around the cabin with soft smiles. The atmosphere had transformed from the usual polite distance of first-class travel to something warmer, more connected. 5 across, the elderly man murmured to his wife, 9 letters. A positive change in thinking or behavior. She looked up, her eyes twinkling as she watched the flight attendants prepare for takeoff. Evolution, she answered, and somehow it seemed to fit the moment perfectly. As the engines roared to life and the plane began its journey down the runway, passengers who would normally be absorbed in their own worlds found themselves sharing quiet conversations about what they'd witnessed. The businessman was explaining to his seatmate how he'd seen similar situations end very differently. The grandmother was still fielding thoughtful questions from her grandchild about standing up for what's right. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It had become a shared experience, a moment in time when a group of strangers had witnessed the power of choosing understanding over anger, growth over punishment. As the plane lifted off the ground, everyone knew they were carrying with them not just their luggage, but a lesson in humanity that would stay with them long after they reached their destination. Would you like me to continue with the final part 8 of the story? 6 months after that memorable flight, Snoop was back at the same airport, preparing for another business trip. As he waited in the first-class lounge, a familiar face approached, the co-pilot from that day, though this time in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember me," the former co-pilot said softly, standing respectfully at a slight distance. His posture was different now, more open, more genuine. "I've been hoping our paths would cross again." Snoop looked up from his phone, his expression thoughtful. "I remember," he said simply, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. The morning sun streamed through the airport windows, much like it had that day 6 months ago. The former co-pilot sat down, pulling out a worn envelope from his jacket. "I've been carrying this letter around for months, hoping I'd get a chance to give it to you in person." He placed it carefully on the table between them. "After that day, I went through some serious changes." He explained how the airline had required him to take sensitivity training, but he'd gone further on his own. He'd sought out counseling to understand his biases, volunteered with community organizations, and even started speaking to other airline crews about his experience. "That moment could have ended my career," he admitted, his voice steady with newfound understanding. "Instead, it changed my life. I'm training to become a diversity and inclusion coordinator for the airline now." The tech entrepreneur's video had indeed gone viral, but not in the way most viral videos do. Instead of creating more division, it had sparked meaningful discussions about how to handle prejudice with dignity and wisdom. Companies had used it in training sessions, teachers had shown it in classrooms, and it had become a powerful example of how to turn conflict into opportunity. The grandmother and her grandchild from that flight had even started a social media movement called Choose Growth Over Anger, sharing stories of people choosing understanding over confrontation. Their initiative had reached thousands, inspiring others to handle difficult situations with grace. "Your letter," Snoop said, picking up the envelope. "I'll read it. But more importantly, what are you doing with what you learned?" His question carried the same wisdom that had transformed that tense moment 6 months ago. The former co-pilot smiled, pulling out his phone to show pictures of himself speaking to airline training classes. "I tell them my story," he said. "Not as a confession, but as a testimony to the power of change. I tell them about the man who had every right to be angry, but chose to teach instead." As they talked, current airline crew members passing through the lounge would pause, recognizing them from the video that had become part of their training. Some even stopped to share how that incident had changed how they approached their own biases and interactions with passengers. Their conversation was interrupted by the boarding call for Snoop's flight. As they stood, the former co-pilot extended his hand, just as Snoop had done 6 months ago. "Thank you," he said, for showing me a better way. Snoop shook his hand firmly. Thank you for being willing to learn, he replied. That's the harder part. As Snoop boarded his flight, he found himself in the same seat, 2A. But this time, the first-class cabin felt different. Not because of any physical changes, but because somewhere in the sky, a story was still being told about the day when confrontation turned into conversation, and anger gave way to understanding. The morning sun streamed through the window, casting the same warm glow it had 6 months ago. But now it illuminated something different, a testament to the power of choosing wisdom over wrath, and the ripple effect that one moment of grace can have on countless lives. The end. This concluding part brings the story full circle, showing the lasting impact of that day and the real changes it inspired, while maintaining the human element that made the original incident so powerful.